Hello, everybody. Welcome to this month's Hobby Hour. My name's Kirk Watson. I'm the founding dean of the Hobby School of Public Affairs. And as you know, each month on the third Wednesday of each month at noon, we have what we call the Hobby Hour, which is a discussion about policy and politics with people that know something about that and know, in many cases, a lot about specific topics. This is going to be a fun one because we have four people that are very versed in business in the state of Texas. And we're going to talk about the connection of business and the legislative sessions. Well, I was going to say the legislature, which of course most of you, if not all of you, know the Texas legislature is in session, but we're down to the very end of that session. We just have a little bit of time left to the end of the month of May, and that will bring an end to the regular session of the legislature. So what we're going to do is talk to these four people a little bit about how that legislative session has gone with regard to the agenda for business in the state of Texas. Before we start, I want to mention a couple of things. One is that if you have questions, please feel free to put those questions in the Q&A feature. What I intend to do is try to work some of those questions in as we go along, but certainly at the end, if we've got questions, at the end of the hobby hour, we will have those audience questions and I'll pose those to our panelists. Now, some people don't know, but in our big cities and big regions, we have a number of economic development or business groups that typically people think of as the chambers of commerce. But those chambers of commerce, also many of them are part of other organizations, and including an organization that I know a little bit about from my time in local government and being involved with the Greater Austin Chamber of Commerce back a few years ago. And that's what's known as the Metro 8 Chamber of Commerce, which is made up of the chambers of the 8 largest cities in the state of Texas. And we're pleased today to have with us 4, so 50% of the Metro 8 Chambers of Commerce, the leaders of those 4. And I want to introduce them to you. First of all, we have with us Bob Harvey. Bob is the president and the CEO of the Greater Houston Partnership, which is the Houston region's principal business organization. Prior to joining the partnership in 2012, Bob was active in the Houston business community, first as a consultant with McKinsey & Company, and then as the vice chair of Reliant Energy. He serves, in addition to being the CEO of the Greater Houston Partnership, he serves on the boards of Houston Exponential, Good Reason Houston, the Greater Houston Convention and Visitors Bureau, and the Center for Houston's Future. He's also a trustee emeritus of the United Way of Greater Houston and the Post Oak School. Joining Bob is Laura Huffman. Laura is the president and the CEO of the Greater Austin Chamber of Commerce. Prior to joining in that role at the chamber, Laura served as the Texas State Director for the Nature Conservancy. And during her 12-year tenure at the Conservancy, she worked with the Texas legislature and many members of that legislature to draft policy with far-reaching ramifications for statewide water conservation, and she spearheaded the expansion of water protection funds across Central Texas. Her experience also includes over 15 years in city management for the city of Austin and the city of San Marcos, where she helped safeguard water supply. She worked to strengthen the economy and to protect the area's natural assets. They'll be joined by Michael Jacobson, who is the president and the CEO of the Arlington Chamber of Commerce. Previously, Michael was the director of Intel's Corporate Responsibility Office, managed Intel's corporate team in California and in Texas, and also worked in Intel's corporate real estate and site development group. Before he was at Intel, Michael was the director of development at the Fort Worth Chamber of Commerce when that Chamber of Commerce ranked in the top 10 in the United States for business recruitment. Earlier in his career, Michael held positions as assistant to the deputy secretary for management planning and operations for the United States Department of Housing and Urban Development, a special assistant to the Commissioner for the Social Security Administration, and special assistant to the administrator of the Urban Mass Transportation Administration. And last but not least is Richard Perez. Richard is the president and the CEO of the San Antonio Chamber of Commerce. During his tenure, that chamber has focused on significant issues that impact the business community, including the labor peace agreement, championing the city's non-discrimination ordinance, and securing city council passage of the Vista Ridge pipeline project to ensure a stable water supply for the future. Previously, he served as the City of Laredo's assistant to the city manager, the special assistant to the Deputy Secretary of the United States Department of Housing and Urban Development during the Clinton administration, and he served on the San Antonio City Council as a city council member. So I want to say thank you to all four of you. I'm very appreciative, and I know our audience will be as we begin this discussion. So I've characterized it. This is coming to the end of a legislative session that many would say was tumultuous. Of course, COVID has made a difference in pretty much everything. Been a lot of hard issues, but every session there's an assessment of how business and the business community did during a legislative session. So let's talk a little bit about that. And I want to start, Michael, I'm going to start with you. The reason I didn't mention it in the introduction, but I want to mention it, is that Michael, in addition to his role at the Arlington Chamber, is also the chair of that Metro 8 Chamber of Commerce that I mentioned. And so, Michael, let's talk at least at first here a little bit about not the specifics necessarily or the substance of a legislative agenda for the broad business community, but really the process of how you go about putting together a legislative agenda. And let's start with the Metro 8. Why don't you talk a little bit about how the business community in the state, with its disparate parts, how it puts together the so-called business agenda. And thanks for being a part of this.
Yeah, I'm happy to be here. Thank you very much. And you're absolutely right. Just getting to a strategy could seem challenging, but because we are 8 chambers, we have 8 boards, and at times we have different priorities. But when it comes to Metro 8, you mentioned the 8 large cities that make up almost $1 trillion and a half of our GDP, and somewhere around 21 million people living in our region. We're really centered on pro-growth policies. What do we do to keep the economy growing? So keep Texas as one of the leading economies in the world, which it is. So that helps sort of get us centered. And then we look at, okay, so we want to remain one of the leading economies in the world. What are those building blocks that will keep us on that path? And so you land on things like competitiveness, economic development, and then infrastructure. I'm going to put this in an infrastructure issue. Education, healthcare, transportation, all of those things that help support the economy. So the one thing that we all have in common is that desire to keep Texas a leading economic engine. And then we all believe that those sort of buckets are key buckets to make sure that we're going to remain that leading economy. And then it's looking at a particular session and saying, okay, so what do we think is going to be on the roadmap this session? What do we think we have potential for success? Where do we think there are risks? And you just make that assessment. We all have really, really good public policy team members who make the CEOs look a lot smarter than we are on these issues. And we evaluate it and come up with our strategy based on that after several meetings.
Got it. So let's now take it, since I've got you talking about how the Metro 8 does it, let's talk a little bit about, and I'm going to ask each person this question, but let's talk a little bit about your individual chamber. the Arlington Chamber in your
Sure.
case, and then I'm going to go through the others too. But do you do it much the same way in terms of trying to come up with a consensus position that you're going to seek? And then tell us what were the top priorities this session for the Arlington Chamber?
Okay, and by the way, the top sessions for the top strategies for Arlington, top objectives were very similar to Metro 8. But yeah, so as a chamber, we're led by our board, and one of the guidelines that we have is because prioritization is key, and it's challenging because you have a lot of people with a lot of opinions trying to determine the right direction. So for us, we look for 80% of our board members to be aligned around a priority. And if we reach that trigger of 80%, then we're very confident that we're in the right path. So we kind of look at that trigger, but every chamber is going to do it differently. Doesn't have to be 80%, but that's kind of what we look at. We want that sort of alignment with our board members, and we think that makes our voice a strong voice. For the chamber, here, this session, it really was about keeping our economic development tools in place, fully funding education, making sure that transportation funds remain transportation funds, protecting public-private partnerships, very similar to what you're going to hear on the Metro 8. Last session, we had a couple of very specific things we were trying to do for Arlington. This session, not so much, other than, of course, UTA, University of Texas at Arlington, is going to be very high on our agenda, and that would be a specific Arlington thing.
That's a good. Okay, and we'll come back and talk about some of those specifics. Bob, let me move over to you. From your perspective, how does the Greater Houston Partnership put together its so-called business agenda? And what were some of the priorities going into this session?
Well, Kirk, our process is very similar to Mike's. We literally start at the end of one session to start planning for the next session. Part of it, there are things that don't get done in one session, so that automatically becomes a priority for the next session. There are things that you accomplish in a session that you want to protect in the next session, right? So immediately we start building that up. We have an extensive committee structure. I'm sure all these chambers do. So issues go to committees. Committees work up their positions where they can. That goes to our Public Policy Steering Committee. That goes to our Executive Committee. That goes to our board. And by August of the year prior to the session, we've come together around an agenda. So we spend, call it almost 18 months getting ready for session. And then during session, we're having to react more real time. Mike talked about his 80% rule. We tend to say at the partnership, we'll take a position if we have a consensus on our board. And that word consensus gets used a lot. And it really says that we default to not taking a position unless we have a consensus. I mean, there are so many issues out there that we could take a position on. So we really strive to get to a consensus at every level, at the committee, and then each of those other levels. For this session, the big three that Mike talked about, the ones that we always talk about at Metro 8, public education. We had great progress last session with House Bill 3. So we come into this session thinking, how do we protect House Bill 3? How do we fund it? I mean, that was all about channeling money more effectively to public ed. So it has a lot to do with the budget as well as just how it's done. Transportation, this has kind of been an easy session for transportation. I mean, there has been more money available in this session than any of us thought there would be just a few months ago. And boy, does that change a session, right?
Yes,
and so that environment's been there. And then economic development incentives. And as you probably know, and I'm sure we'll come back to, that is still a struggle in this session to get one of our key incentives, Chapter 313, reauthorized. But in addition to that, just like Mike, we have our own issues. We're very involved in the energy transition in Houston, and we need some help in Austin. We need to be able to have the state permit CO2 disposal wells. Well, how arcane is that? Well, that's really important. If we're gonna sequester CO2 in Texas like they are in other states, we need legislation. All of us have been involved on this question of the digital divide. The fact that we're all trying to get internet access, broadband access to both rural and urban communities. That's an unusual Metro 8. In other words, that's the kind of thing that got added to our agenda appropriately, and then we're all working together. But that's just some of what we're working on, Kirk.
That's big. I hear you. And going into this session, I think all of us would agree that the fear of not having money, and the way we thought this was going to be, especially as it applied to whether HB3 was going to continue to get funding, the public education, that very transformative effort from the last session. But having money does make a big difference in how things play out. So, Laura, talk about the Greater Austin Chamber of Commerce.
Sure. Well, I won't repeat the process that we use because it's extremely similar to what Bob just described. We've got a standing policy committee. We do a fair amount of surveying to groups that we work with closely in Austin. For example, we've got a really strong healthcare community, an emerging mental health care community, our school superintendents and people in the education area. So we do a little bit of outreach to find out what their agendas are and how we can amplify those agendas. Core business, of course, is public education, infrastructure, economic development incentives, all the things that Michael and Bob just mentioned. There were some local opportunities also. Austin always has some local opportunities. So we had issues like, related to police defunding. We had issues around homelessness, which will affect the whole state. We had some neat opportunities. I know one that's near and dear to your heart is funding for ASH and making sure that as we rethink our physical health services in Austin through the initiation of a medical school and lots of other initiatives, that mental health is also innovating and emerging at the same time.
For those that don't know, ASH is a reference to the Austin State Hospital, which we have just a short cut and call it ASH. So yeah, thank you for mentioning that.
Yeah. We worked hard on IH-35. You were a part of that. Those highway projects are really, really important to this community, and they match up with mobility program that voters just approved. And I would say that the snowstorm put a little bit of a curveball in the session from a lot of our big industrial customers, for example, that had real questions about Texas's grid and how decisions were made at the local level to keep plants on or turn them off. So that's an example of something that pops up during session. My experience is there are always a handful of issues like that pop up.
Yeah, good. Thank you. Richard, talk about San Antonio.
Well, thank you for the opportunity, Kirk, to be with you and my colleagues. It's always a pleasure to join them. Really a very, very dedicated group of individuals who focus on their communities and do all the things they can to make them better. So I'll touch on three pieces to our local agenda that are very important and somewhat unique. Military is a big, important industry in San Antonio. And so we have the largest joint base in all of the entire Department of Defense. So things that affect the military are something that's important to us because they can't advocate for themselves, certainly not at the Texas legislature. One of the issues that they have had is being able to cut costs for doing projects locally on base. And so we've been pushing for a process to allow for counties, cities, counties, and even TxDOT to partner with the military to be able to allow the military to add their projects onto the projects that local governments or the state is doing, to be able to have the economies of scales and thereby lower their costs and make the ability to get the projects done a lot quicker. And they pay an administrative fee to those entities. And the biggest one is on the governor's desk right now that will allow TxDOT to partner with our military bases for things like road reconstruction, buying property for road expansion, those kinds of things. A big, giant issue, which seems mundane, but very important to the continued efficient operation of military bases. Tourism and hospitality, a huge industry in San Antonio and is still pretty much on its back because of COVID. And so being able to assist them to bring people back downtown and masks and all the things that we all have dealt with that have been a bit of a bear. But additionally, we have the Alamo. And so the Alamo is in the midst of a redevelopment, getting the master plan passed, and then some resources coming from the state to help us get that thing funded, the projects within it funded, very important for the long-term hospitality industry in San Antonio. And finally, water. Laura touched upon water. San Antonio gets the majority of its water from an underground aquifer. and we've diversified our water, but we also have rules when we're bringing water in from other places. Groundwater rules in particular are different for the different groundwater districts, and trying to have some uniformity and fairness so that as we bring water into Texas or to San Antonio, excuse me, that it's easier and it's not a big administrative burden. So those are just 3 examples, Kirk, of what some of the uniqueness to what we do here in San Antonio.
Yeah, it's interesting as I listened to that, wearing my hat as a former member of the legislature, former member of the Senate for quite a while, how some of these issues are decade-old issues, and even before. And I kind of want to start with one of those, which is something that got mentioned as I was listening to it, and that's economic development tools. And one of the things that got mentioned was Chapter 313, which is a relied upon economic development tool for chambers of commerce, and one that I've been familiar with. Let me go back to that and ask, because what was mentioned was that's still kind of in flux. I'll start with you, Michael. Why don't you talk about first what 313 is, and then what its status is as we come into literally the last few days of this.
So Chapter 313 is a tool that allows us to level the tax burden on capital-intensive companies. So Texas is at a disadvantage because of its property tax rate to be able to attract or retain large capital investment. Chapter 313 sort of leveled that for those large capital investments and allowed the school districts to participate without harm in reducing that tax rate on large capital intensive investments. It's resulted in about 66,000 jobs and $120 billion of capital investment. So it's really worked and helped us secure in this state some substantial economic engines. But to do that, we really, on capital intensive, there's no reason for a TI or a Samsung, or I could go down a list of companies that they should be paying 5,000 times in property tax per employee what an average company does. So how do we level that so that we can incentivize that investment into capital and into jobs? And it's just been a critical tool that we've had at the state now. Where it stands, it's still in committee. It probably at this point is looking like a 3-year or a 2-year extension of the existing program. We're still advocating, obviously, for something more than that, but and what they would do is just extend it really without changing anything. And of course, we were advocating as well for simplifying the process, and there were things that would have made it an even more advantageous tool. But what we're looking at right now, I believe, and Bob or Laura or Richard could comment on this as well, but what we're probably looking at is an extension of the existing program for a short period of time.
And that would be, and I'll ask Bob, Laura, Richard, any one of you can jump in, but because of its status this late in the session, it would be considered a win just to get an extension of it. Is that what you're saying? Bob, why don't you, Laura, or Richard, comment on that?
Yeah, we still hope and expect to get that limited extension that Mike talked about, short-term extension, none of the major modifications that we had hoped to see. But there are no givens, you're right, at this stage of a session. So we'll see in the next couple of days, frankly, how it comes out of committee and how it gets addressed. The difficulty with economic development incentives, particularly tax abatements, is that they really don't have any friends at either end of the political spectrum, right? I'd say the left.
Who do you go to? So good. I'm glad you brought that up.
So you have to be talking to that centrist legislator of whatever party who just simply cares about maintaining this economic engine in Texas. I mean, if as long as you keep the focus there, you tend to get a good reaction. There's always a view that the company would have come here anyway. It's one of those unprovable, unknowable issues. If we didn't have 313 in our quiver, and we're talking to companies years ago about coming to Texas and talking about this incentive, we probably wouldn't be here today with them making an application. So it always gets hard to say, did they have to have the 313? I would say it's at least been very coincident with an extraordinary period of growth in Texas and across all of Texas, actually. The school districts, as has been pointed out, it really doesn't cost them anything, in the sense that these are investments that were not on the tax rolls previously, that are in effect not fully put on the tax roll for a period of time. So, they weren't on anyone's tax roll before. And the way it works in Texas is, given the formula funding system, what doesn't appear on your tax record effectively gets made up for with formula funding from the state. So this view that the state in effect pays for it. Well, it does pay for it. But again, it's money we didn't have. We always have to remind folks, this is investment that didn't exist, tax dollars that were not previously coming in that we're trying to attract here. And you get all the secondary benefits. You give the incentive to the central player, but let's not forget all the economic activity that occurs all around that player that does go into the tax books right away. So that's our argument, but it's a hard argument to make year after year.
Laura, Richard, you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, if I could add, the other part of this 2-year extension is to do an interim study to actually see the effectiveness of the program. And for San Antonio, we have a handful of examples. The best one is Toyota. When Toyota brought its truck manufacturing plant to San Antonio, that is, as you've heard, very capital intensive. Bringing those robots into your community to help assemble these vehicles is not an inexpensive undertaking. And if you look at your tax burden, the part that you pay to the school district generally is the biggest part of any tax burden for a business or an individual. And so that's what helps us bring those guys here, puts them here, brings literally thousands of jobs. And in the case of San Antonio, it was 2,000 jobs for just the Toyota plant proper, and then another 3,000 with the ancillary tier 1 suppliers. So we're talking good jobs, and it brought in a sophistication into our economy with manufacturing that we really didn't have, and really puts us at a level to be able to compete countrywide and worldwide with those kinds of opportunities.
Good. Laura?
Yeah, I'll add a couple of things. One is, I think that so often this conversation happens without any context. Here's an important piece of context. These are performance-based agreements. Companies have to produce what they said they were going to produce in terms of investment, in terms of jobs. They often agree to other kinds of things in the community, like community development programs, agreements with school districts to build workforce development programs, and that performance becomes the basis of the tax abatement. And so I think that's important. The other thing that I think is important is just in the world of economic development and the way that we approach this in the state of Texas is this is a tool that when you need it, because the truth is Toyota, Tesla, Samsung, all these big companies, they can locate anywhere in the world. We're not just competing within Texas, we're competing within the country and beyond the country. And that's a real competition. And so you have to be able to go toe to toe with other states even that will quite literally hand over the keys to the state. They'll do anything to get these companies. So those are important pieces of context for the economic development tools. But the other thing to say is that the number one thing that we all compete with for economic development is local talent. And that quite literally is connecting these companies to families. And so anything that's why SB3 is so important. HB3 is so important. That's why workforce development programs are so important. Texas' ability to have talent in all of our major Texas cities, that's the most fundamental thing that we bring to the table. And so infrastructure and talent are huge economic development tools. And I think too seldom do we talk about all of the economic development that occurs because we've worked so hard to make sure that kids coming out of high school have opportunities either for 4-year degrees, 2-year degrees, or training programs that make them, ready for the jobs of the future. And that's what Toyota is offering, and that's what Tesla's offering. So I find that when people start picking this apart and they go straight to 313, they leave all the context aside about what economic development does for these cities. And it ends up sounding as though it's somehow disconnected from people. And it's really not. Economic development is community development. And when companies come to town, not only do they bring their robots, but they hire our people. and they invest in our philanthropies, and they grow our communities, and they become leaders of our communities. So I think that context is super important.
Yeah, that's it. That is important. I appreciate you bringing that up. Let me go ahead, Mike.
One comment, and I love what Laura said, and most of us in our mission statements, I mean, for us, it's economic and community prosperity that drives us. They're just intrinsically linked, and they should be, and that makes it critical. The one thing, since I work for Intel, I can't let the time go by without saying that, in 1997, when we were trying to get this legislation initially passed, and we were going to be building a campus, a major manufacturing campus in North Fort Worth, which unfortunately, because we couldn't get a program in place at that time, the decision to move forward on that facility, or it had been a large campus, we decided to move on. Since that time, and this I don't think is an exaggeration, but don't hold me to these numbers. I don't work for Intel anymore, but probably in Arizona and Oregon, there's been over $50 billion invested in semiconductor manufacturing in those two states during that period of time.
Yeah.
And a big chunk of that could have been slated for Texas, but unfortunately we couldn't get legislation in place back then. So now we have it. Let's make sure we don't lose it.
For those that might be interested in the status of 313, you've mentioned that it's in committee. Can you tell us which committee we're expecting it to come out of? So if anybody wanted to pay attention to that, and I know that's probably an unfair.
Yeah, I know, and I should have, Bob, I should have the right committee.
Yeah.
I know.
Look, I understand. Don't worry about it. You have people that are helping you, but they're probably sitting right across the hallway from the door of that committee right now. So
It's in the Senate Natural Resources Committee.
Yeah.
Okay.
And that was from one of our team that just texted me. So indeed, you're right, Kirk.
They're right there, yes, watching.
Look, I've been there, done that. I get it. So good.
100% of the GR staff just texted us.
Yeah, that's right. Well, good. So I wanted to, for those that are interested in following that, so we have focused on economic development as one of the priorities and tools, and specifically focused on 313 because that is kind of the eco-devo tool of the session, right? And the discussion. And by the way, I remember that being the tool and discussions in multiple sessions over the past. But let's talk about a couple of other things that aren't necessarily, see, that's the kind of thing that a lot of folks would say, well, of course, that's economic development, that's business community agenda. But let's talk about a couple of things that during this session there has been discussion about that it may not be something that people would say, oh, that's a traditional business community idea or thought. Things like, and I'm just going to mention a couple, and I'm not trying to label anything, but I want to throw out and get the conversation started. But things like Medicaid expansion, things like gun safety, issues like LGBTQ rights, issues like voting rights. So what I want to do is I want to, and I'm not going to ask you to comment on all of that, but my question is from a business community standpoint, at a time when the legislature is, particularly this session, I say particularly, every session has a flavor to it, but during this session there have been a lot of those issues that have come up, and there's been a call for the business community to be involved or not be involved. How do you go about making those decisions on those issues and then becoming involved when they're not the kinds of things that were got listed as your priorities when each one of you kind of laid out your individual priorities? And Bob, I'm going to start with you.
Yeah, first we ask ourselves, is there a business nexus to the issue? And sometimes there is, and sometimes there isn't. That doesn't necessarily settle it, but where there's a business nexus to the issue, we're going to be much more inclined to spend the time talking about it, getting involved in it. Things that relate to employment practices, those clearly have a business nexus, so we're going to talk about those. I'll use one further afield, maybe constitutional carry. We might decide that that's an issue, but it doesn't have a strong nexus with business. There is some, because retailers will say it has some implications for how they do business, but others will say that's not so much a business issue. So we look for that issue first. Then we try to decide, how much is this a substantive issue versus a partisan political issue? And there's always a little bit of both. We would rather be dealing with substance than partisan political issues. And then we ask ourselves, can we influence this? Is it a binary question, up or down, or by our getting involved, can we actually help create better legislation? Sometimes that door is open. We're much more inclined to get involved if we think we can improve something and then support it than something that we're just going to have to make a binary decision on. But all that said, business is being expected to do more. Business is simply getting more involved. We read these stories all the time. There was a great story, I believe it was in Forbes this week, about how surveying CEOs right now, roughly half of them think business should be more involved in these issues. And the other half, literally 50-50, thinks we need to pull back. This is not working. This is not fun. This is not good for my company or my shareholders. And frankly, that's kind of how it feels within the partnership. It kind of feels 50-50, and that makes it difficult.
Yeah, I imagine. I want to ask you, are there others that want to comment on that? And then I want to ask about a couple of specific items.
Well, I have just a general comment, which to me is just interesting. You have people in the process that say corporations ought to stay out of government. Our political system's being corrupted by corporations. And those, by the way, are from the left and the right, right? The far left, far right will make those sort of statements. But when there's an issue that they're interested in, by God, business better be there. And so it's just, I like the way Bob talked about that balance. It's a challenge that we face. And every business community in the state is going to look different as well. And so for Metro 8 and trying to bring us all together, it could be a challenge. But I think Bob laid it out pretty well.
I've always found that it's interesting, and it's not just a business deal, but in pretty much all of public policy, if I'm for it, it's just common sense. But if I'm not, you're just playing politics, and I think that happens a lot on business issues. Laura, Richard, you want to add something to that?
Yeah, I just want to emphasize Bob's point and add this. I think this landscape is shifting. I think that issues that traditionally chambers and underlying businesses didn't have to get involved on, they could sit on the sidelines and say, this isn't a business issue. I think that day and age is coming to an end. And over again, I hear executives in the companies here in Austin say, one of the reasons why they're having to engage in issues that they previously did not have to engage in is because they're competing for workforce. And when you are trying to win the talent competition, then part of what's being demanded of them, and I'm not even talking about shareholders or boards, I'm talking about talent, retaining employees and all of that. There's just an increasing demand for CEOs and companies to take positions on these issues. And so the world is just changing a little bit. I think sometimes we get it just right, and I think sometimes we miss it. But to be fair to all involved, this is a little bit new. It's not typical for businesses or chambers to get involved with bathroom bills, and yet we did. It's not typical for chambers and businesses to get involved with LGBTQ issues, and yet we did. Expansion of Medicare, that's easier, right? There's a nexus there, but police defunding, homelessness, some of the social issues, those are newer areas for us. And I think almost anything can be defined as a business issue, but to everyone's point, if we get involved in everything, we spread ourselves too thin. So I think we're all learning, frankly, in this arena. And I think so are a lot of the CEOs that belong to these organizations.
Yeah, and if I could add, Kirk, that, if you look at our legislative agenda as a Metro 8, just 3 or 4 sessions back, it was huge, very much like our own agendas in our cities. But over time, we realized we needed to focus on the big 30,000-foot issues affecting Texas, and we would focus on those much more pointed issues directly as chambers. So the Metro 8, big picture, local chambers, the blocking and tackling. And I'll say regarding the talent issue. Right now, every business in San Antonio certainly is working to try to find new employees. So Laura, you're right on in that they have to be more proactive to be able to show their employees that they care. And so that's why things are different. So yeah, the things are just different. It changed. But the other thing I think in the art of what we all do as CEOs is there's a lot of behind the scenes work that we do. You know, not everything we do, we put a press release out and say, hey, we're, you know, charging the gate right now. We are picking up the phone. We're going and visiting and say, hey, this is really not a good idea. And that's where I think our strength lies in our ability to do it quietly. Now the world doesn't know, but we know. And our members know based on their priorities and their wants and desires. So that's the art of what we do. And I'm very proud of our ability to get things done that way.
Yeah. Okay, I want to bring up because Medicaid expansion got mentioned a couple of times, and at least my perception is, one person's perception is that it was not, Medicaid expansion has grown into, and that may not be the right phrase, but it has become or evolved into a business agenda item. It didn't start that way. And it had kind of to go back to Bob's, the way is it substantive versus partisan politics. It may have started with a feel of partisan politics, but now it seems to me to have moved into more of a business agenda. Talk a little bit about that and where we are. I mean, we're not going to see, I mean, there may be one aspect where Medicaid gets expanded. It looks like it still has a chance, but not a broad Medicaid expansion. But it's now a priority. It seems to be a priority of the business community. Bob, let me start with you on that too, and talk a little bit about that.
Well, this session has been quite a roller coaster on this issue.
Yeah.
I mean, we'll come back to that. If you look back over the last several sessions, we've gone from it being something you literally couldn't talk about in public. In other words, it was so contentious in the Capitol that even, you know, we kept joking, even using that phrase, Medicaid expansion, would get you booted out of a lot of people's offices, right? So we found ways, almost like Richard was saying, we found ways to communicate and influence without being right out front talking about it. We began to be more optimistic going into this session. And you heard all of us talking about meeting the needs of the uninsured. You know, we were clearly targeting this issue, still perhaps not using the phrase Medicaid expansion, but it was very clear what we were talking about. And we were seeing some receptivity, I'd say in the fall. You got a sense that things might move. The Trump administration doing that long-term 1115 waiver extension at the end of the term kind of took some of the momentum away because all of a sudden the issue went away. If we have a long-term 1115 waiver, we thought for a moment that the new presidential administration might immediately remove that extension and that would force the legislature. Well, President Biden did do that, but he did it so late in the session that it hasn't provided the impetus. Now, so that's, you know, that's the roller coaster. I'm like you, Kirk, I'm not as optimistic at this moment as I was early on. We are making some headway. We're taking pieces of the uninsured issue and making some progress. And groups like Texas 2036 has really made a huge effort about how to inform the public, the legislature, the people like who are on this call. How do you understand this issue, the gives and gets for Texas by being more willing to work with the federal government to meet the needs of Texas uninsured? And we all know we have the largest uninsured population in the country. And that's a business issue because it increases the cost of the insurance we buy as employers, but it affects the quality of life in our communities every day. So it's very much a business issue. We're just waiting to figure out kind of how to move this issue that next increment. But
Good. Anybody want to add, or I'm going to move on to another area of question, but I'm happy to hear.
I want to again applaud 2036 because one of the things I think they're doing is they're bringing data and tools to help us understand what the impact of access to healthcare would bring to us. And hopefully we're going to move this from a political discussion to a discussion on data and real information. So I really applaud Tom Luce and Margaret Spellings and that whole group and what they're doing to maybe move it away from political discussion to one really focused on facts.
Good.
If I could just add, you know,
Please.
it all stems from uncompensated care that's having to go to emergency rooms to get taken care of, which is the most expensive care that you can
Yes.
use. And so that means all of our hospital systems are just, it's a very expensive undertaking, and they're busting, and they just cannot continue to do that going forward. And then it at the end of the day, it's also about, again, that talent development and retention that we're all clamoring for. If you have sick people that are not being able to function, then that doesn't help you grow your workforce and focus on the business and growing that business through that talent development. So, I mean, it's got a ripple effect that goes right through everything that we all do as CEOs.
Well, good. So as we come to the end of our hobby hour here, what I want to do is look back at the legislative session, even though we're not quite done with it. But based upon the conversation that we've had, from priorities to some specificity in the substance of some of the bills that have been looked at, and I want to kind of throw the question out there: how pro-business has this legislative session really been? What pro-business legislation has passed or is on track to make it through the session? You know, people like to brag that Texas is business friendly, but have we seen that this session? I mean, we just talked about the status of 313 and difficulties there, and we've talked about Medicaid expansion and difficulties there. So let me start, Mike. I'm going to start with you. Rank and talk to us a little bit about how it's all played out so far.
You know, looking at our overall agenda, I feel pretty good about where we're going to end this session, particularly not knowing what we were going to end this session and the fear of what budget would do. And so if I look at it and look at education funding and transportation funding, and we'll see on economic development tools where that lands. I'm pretty happy at where we are. And then you look at some other things which we haven't talked about, but you know, liability reform, protecting business from frivolous lawsuits around COVID-19 is a huge win. Protecting businesses from paying the franchise tax on PPP loans is a big win. So there's a lot that has been done. So we tend to talk about 5 or 6 issues,
Right.
and then we try to cast the success on those 5 or 6 issues. The reality is there's so much more to it than that. And I think Texas is a great place to do business, and you see the legislature continually doing things that position us to be successful. There's wins all the time. I would say why we prioritize, and we do this ourselves, we focus on those top 6 or 7 issues. You also have to look below that level to see other things that are occurring that have a huge impact on our business community. And there have been big successes during this session.
Bob, what you give your perspective?
I'd share that take very much. You know, sometimes things are kind of easy in appearance, and addressing the digital divide. You know, we haven't been able to move that issue forward session after session. And then this session, somewhat related to COVID, frankly, and the things we've learned about telemedicine and education access and all that. An issue like that moves through fairly quickly and cleanly, gets the priority of the governor, priority of the leadership comes together. That doesn't mean it's not hugely significant. It just didn't take a big fight to get something like that over the goal line. So I think we'll look back and see this as a productive session for business and for the state in general. You know, we had a new speaker. You never know, right? A new speaker, what's the dynamic going to be in the House? And I would say the House has functioned well under Speaker Phelan. It didn't have to, but it has. We've had sessions, Kirk, you remember, where the Senate and the House just stopped sending legislation down the hall. I mean, the whole session just ended prematurely. This has not been one of those sessions, despite the social issues. There's been that layer of social issues, but underneath that, there's been a lot of basic substantive work being done. So I think we're going to be happy. I'm going to mention a couple of things that are perhaps more unique to us. There's a piece of legislation from a few years ago, House Bill 1842, which created an accountability system for public education, K-12 in Texas, right? That said you cannot have a failing school for more than 5 years, or the education commissioner will appoint a board of managers. You know, it turns out the courts didn't like the language of 1842. They found issue with it. We're trying to get a piece of legislation passed that would simply kind of reassert the ability of the commissioner to deal with an underperforming school district that's underperformed for 5 consecutive years. You probably know what school district I'm thinking about in saying that, but it is a statewide statute. So something like that is still, that's a tough piece of legislation, right? It's a statewide bill, not of interest to every member. You know, the rural communities, they look first to their school superintendent for advice on what to vote for. So it's one of those issues that's really important to the urban community. We tend to have the poorly functioning urban schools, but we have to get the whole legislature behind it. That's one, I mean, my judgment on this session in some ways will be tempered a lot by how that piece of legislation ends up.
Thank you for that. Laura, you want to talk a little bit about the perception of a pro-business legislative session and how it's playing out? Oh, you're on mute.
You missed the whole answer. Yeah, I mean, I, definitely agree with what Michael and Bob just talked about. If you look at the agendas and how we shook out on the pieces of legislation that were filed within those agendas, it looks pretty good. I would say this, I think that you can pretty much unilaterally say that if we were to spend more time thinking about, and Senator, this is a drumbeat of yours, of what capacities do we need to be building into this state in order to maintain and grow our success, versus just making sure that we're hanging on for the next 3 to 5 years. Anytime that we were to spend thinking about resilience, energy transition, long-term water supplies, local talent, healthy populations, quality of life, those are all the things that are why we're successful today. And to me, anytime that we could spend at a statewide level within session thinking about what it's going to take to keep those things not just intact, but growing and getting better, I'd take that over red meat issues 10 out of 10 times.
Appreciate that answer. Richard?
Kirk, I agree with my colleagues completely. They're right on the mark with all the things they've talked about. A couple of things, though, that we're still and are very important to our economic development focus. That is the enterprise fund. That's the deal closing fund. That's always big for us, and being able to preserve that and keep that active so that we can use that to help close the deals in all of our respective communities. And then the motion picture, the moving industry fund, and there's an incentive program. We see, I think, a big opportunity to attract more of those opportunities to Texas and to our respective communities. And so we need to make the incentives a little easier to use. They have a big administrative burden. And so that's another opportunity that seems still alive, and we could get some traction there. And again, those are good paying jobs of the future, and exciting jobs that we can get our young people excited about.
Yeah. Let me ask you a question about that, because when you did that, I immediately had a flashback to back when I was mayor in Austin. We were trying to create the Austin Film Studios, and we did those kinds of things, and the role that played. And that caused me to think about local control for a second. And you're a former member of a city council. Talk a little bit about local control from the perspective of economic development. I wasn't intending to do that, but you.
Sure. Well, as a former city,
I really thought of that. So
yeah. Well, as a former city council member, local control in my mind deals with, streets, drainage, police, parks, fire, but when a city starts dictating to businesses benefits for their employees, that is beyond what a normal city council should be focusing on. So there is a divergence on what I believe should be kept in the box for local control. And so that's, right now, one of the other potentials that we can get is that the Texas legislature would preempt communities from imposing those kinds of burdens on local businesses, right? And that's a big deal for us. And I know some of my colleagues same. So that's one of them. But local control, and a city needs to have its own ability to be able to go and tell its story at the legislature. And that involves lobbying, that involves all those kinds of things. And that's a contentious issue. But from my personal perspective, I think cities need to have, and cities, counties, other public entities need to have that ability to tell their story, because that is the way that the system works. And if you take a tool like that, people come to our cities because they have quality of life and infrastructure, and all those things we talked about are part of that quality of life. And when you take a city's ability to advocate for itself at the legislature, then you hamstring your community. And so that's what I would say.
My opinion has always been, for what that's worth, my opinion has always been that our state economy is great if it's great because of it's the sum of its regional component parts, and allowing them to have discretion about how they attract and retain that talent that you all have talked about becomes a very important thing. Well, we're at the end of our hobby hour, and I want to say thank you to this great panel: Bob Harvey, Laura Huffman, Mike Jacobson, and Richard Perez. Leaders in economic development, not only in their communities, but in the state of Texas, and have played an instrumental role during this last legislative session. This has been a very informative hobby hour, and I want to say thank you to all of you, not just for being on the hobby hour, but for what you do in the state of Texas and the roles you play. And I appreciate your being somebody that I can reach out to for advice and counsel. So thank you for that as well. So for those that don't know, I'm going to say here at the end of this hobby hour that this is my last hobby hour. I started the hobby hour when I first became the founding dean of the Hobby School of Public Affairs, but I have announced that my term as the founding dean of the Hobby School of Public Affairs will end on May 31st of this year. And I have enjoyed and been extremely honored to be the founding dean of the Hobby School of Public Affairs. I want to say thank you to the provost, Paula Short, who has been as supportive as a person can be. I want to say thank you to the president, the Hobby family, the faculty and staff, and all of the Hobby community in their support of me. It's been a real honor. And it's been fun to do the hobby hour, to get to talk to people like this. So I want to mention that for those of y'all that know about that, it would have been weird for me to do the hobby hour and not say it. And I'm weird enough without just playing into type. So everybody, God bless you all. Thank you for this opportunity, and please stay safe, happy, and healthy. Thanks to the panel. Bye-bye, y'all.
Thank you all. Colleagues, good seeing you all. Take care.
Thank you.